3 years ago, I heard a story that I'll never forget. I was sitting in a lecture hall, not too unlike this, when a girl walked up to a wooden podium to share a story. Her dark hair was slicked back in a low, tight bun, and she was wearing short black heels with a black suit jacket, a couple sizes too big. From afar, her outfit aged her, blending her into the academic environment. But upon a closer look, it was clear that she was no adult, but a young girl. She proceeded to tell the story of how, at the age of 14, 2 years before her talk, she had been kidnapped and enslaved by the Islamic State. How thousands of Yazidis, her ethnic religious minority, had been kidnapped alongside her, used as child soldiers and sex slaves. Her eyes welled up with tears as she talked about how she was shuttled from one fighter to the next, being subject to rape and abuse. She told about one fateful night when she disguised herself as an Arab boy and ran away, pleading with a taxi driver to hide her. Against all odds, he agreed, outrisked his own life and the lives of his family members. He hid her until he was able to smuggle her out of ISIS-occupied territory. She told about why she's sharing this deeply troubling, personal, horrific story. In order that the world may know and never forget the thousands of Yazidi girls just like her that are still today in ISIS captivity, and they are among the millions of people in the world today enslaved as victims of human trafficking. My name is Katherine Trout, and I'm the president of Princeton Against Slavery and Trafficking, Princeton University's student group against human trafficking. I'm a senior in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, where my studies have focused on human rights violations, particularly in the form of human trafficking and genocide. I've conducted extensive research on the effects of human trafficking and have personally combated the trade in avenues like high-tech, journalism, and diplomacy. Human trafficking often remains an elusive term to the average person. And so for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to walk you through what exactly is this highly lucrative criminal enterprise known as modern-day slavery. According to the United Nations Protocol to Prevent and Suppress Victims of Trafficking, sex trafficking, human trafficking, domestic labor, forced labor needs to have 3 different components to qualify as such. Acts, means, and purpose. First, an act needs to occur, which includes the recruitment, transport, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. Second, the means must include force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or bribery. And then finally, the purpose needs to be for exploitation. Examples of exploitation include forced prostitution, the removal of organs, slavery, or other examples. Within all of these, you're able to have human trafficking arrive in different forms, which emphasizes the diversity of human trafficking. It can look very different from one case to the other, yet still be classified as human trafficking. The International Labor Organization estimates 40.3 million human trafficking victims worldwide. Among these are 15.4 million individuals who are victims of forced marriages. Additionally, the organization estimates that there's $150 billion in this industry. Regardless, human trafficking remains a complex industry that manifests in different forms. To be more specific, human trafficking can come in 3 major forms. One is sex trafficking. Now, this form of trafficking is arguably the most well-known, most easily spotted, but can manifest in different forms. First of all, victims can come in the form of being boyfriended into the trade, which is a common technique in the United States. The pimp will find a girl who lacks self-confidence or a strong family network and will coerce her into the trade. He might first ask her to help him make rent 1 month by sleeping with a friend or 2, or introducing her to drugs and alcohol in order to lower her willpower. By this way, then the next step will be introducing her to the sex trade forcing her to sleep with multiple men every day under threat, force, and coercion. Force, fraud, and coercion are key tributes that make up the sex trade. And in the United States, anyone who is forced to have unwanted sex for monetary gain under force, fraud, or coercion automatically qualifies as a sex trafficking victim. Yet around the world, it can look very differently. For instance, it can be disguised as legal prostitution, as it often is in the Netherlands. In 2000, the Netherlands legalized prostitution, making Amsterdam into the famous red light district. However, this made sex traffickers flock to Amsterdam. Then Amsterdam mayor in 2008 stated, according to the New York Times, that we've now seen that this is no longer about small-scale entrepreneurs, but that big crime organizations are now trafficking women, drugs, killings, and other criminal activities. Sex trafficking can also be utilized as a tool of war by established terrorist organizations. For example, Nigeria has struggled for years in combating the use of sex trafficking as a tool of war by the terrorist organization Boko Haram, which regularly has kidnapped hundreds of young schoolgirls, subjecting them to abuse, torture, rape, and death. As I previously mentioned, in 2014, ISIS attacked the Yazidi minority in northern Iraq and used sex slavery as a means of eliminating the Yazidi minority. But sex trafficking can also be a rampant part of the tourism industry, as it has historically been in Cambodia. After the Cambodian genocide of the 1970s and the destabilization of the Cambodian government, sex trafficking took root there, with buyers from all around the world flocking to Cambodia for their specialty, child prostitution. Yet sex trafficking can also take place much closer to home. In New Jersey, in 2017, in October, the FBI's annual national sweep against trafficking produced 42 individuals who were indicted for charges of sex trafficking, child exploitation, and prostitution in New Jersey alone. The sweep rescued 84 minors, including a 5-year-old and a 3-month-old. Besides sex trafficking, though, domestic servitude is the second form of trafficking that's the most prevalent. It often occurs in wealthier countries, such as the United States. Last year, in 2017, the journalist Alex Tizen wrote a cover story for The Atlantic entitled "My Family Slave." It was the most read piece on the internet for 2017. In this article, he talks about his deeply personal realization that his childhood nanny, Lola, was in fact a victim of domestic servitude in his own house. He talks about how she worked every day with little to no pay and was forced to eat scraps and leftovers by herself in the kitchen. How she had no friends or hobbies, faced verbal and physical abuse, and rarely left the house. You see, victims like Lola can often be enslaved and entrapped in human trafficking by a lack of economic mobility, lack of visa credentials, language, cultural barriers. Because of that, they often can be slaves in domestic locations for years at a time, as was the case with Lola. And then finally, forced labor is the other form of primary human trafficking. And in here, you often have individuals who lack economic security but are willing to migrate for work opportunity. In the United States, this can include agricultural workers, massage therapists, factory workers, construction workers. In certain industries, forced labor is much more common than in others. For instance, low profit margins in the commercial fishing industry in Thailand have contributed to high rates of human trafficking and forced labor. Men and boys from Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, and Vietnam can be forced to stay at sea for years at a time, working up to 20 hours every day, 7 days a week. Should they try to disobey orders or escape, they're often subject to abuse, torture, threats, and death. So with all this being said, how then can we stop this? Human traffickers are criminals that benefit by exploiting others. They are relentless innovators that are finding ways to avoid detection and to continue to operate their transnational rings. So what can we do? That's a question that was brewing on my mind for a long time. And so that's why I created a photojournalism project called Humans of Trafficking. I traveled around the world interviewing individuals whose lives had somehow been connected to the human trafficking trade. Their lives had been personally affected as lawyers, doctors, victims, advocates, students. And they had a story to tell, a story about how human trafficking can deeply change and shape a person's life, and ideas about how one could stop it. Some people, like Sawa, an advocate and speaker for the Yazidi minority, who goes around the world sharing about her story of being a captive of ISIS. And by doing so, she empowers other individuals and governments to combat human trafficking. Or Lynn, the Director General of the National Crime Agency of the United Kingdom, the British equivalent of the FBI. She works around the clock finding ways to bust human trafficking rings and put traffickers behind bars. Or Lilach, an NGO worker from Tel Aviv, who regularly works to provide education and empowerment to former prostitutes and sex trafficking victims and enable them to have a new source of employment outside of the sex trade. Or Zach, a student at the University of Oxford, who ran the university's Human Trafficking Action Group last year. He and other students staged demonstrations for up to 24 hours at a time at a busy Oxford Square in order to highlight a horrific human trafficking case that happened on that very square in 2013, where 9 men were ultimately arrested and charged with sex trafficking, child prostitution, and exploitation of 7 different minors, including an 11-year-old girl. These victims of human trafficking were branded, tortured, urinated on, raped, and horrifically abused. Most of them were foster children and orphans. So that raised the question of how can you use your unique strengths in order to combat this trade? Just as these students and advocates and law enforcement and NGO workers were able to find different ways to combat trafficking in their own fields, how can you do that as well? Are you an accomplished statistician that enjoys math? Find ways to improve victim statistics in order to better allocate resources. Are you passionate about entrepreneurship and technology? Find ways to implement blockchain and facial recognition technologies to better identify victims to aid law enforcement. Are you passionate about education and youth? Establish an in-school program that highlights the different signs of human trafficking so that children are able to see them and avoid them. By doing these things, you could really start to change the shape and nature of human trafficking. And that's the question that I want to address for you, is what can you do to combat human trafficking? You can start with what is already your field, whatever you're already passionate about, and using those talents, those gifts, that knowledge to create lasting, impactful social change. Human traffickers are putting everything on the line in order to exploit other individuals for their own gain. Their livelihoods and lives are on the line. And it's going to take more than complacent condemnation of human trafficking to end modern-day slavery. It takes individuals who are willing to put everything on the line in order to stop them. So the final question I pose to you is, are you going to change the world or not? Thank you.